On the 19th of April 1943, a document stamped "Top Secret" landed on Joseph Stalin's desk, forever altering the balance of fear and power in the warring nation. With a single stroke of his pen, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief split the all-powerful People's Commissariat of Internal Affairs, wrested the Army's special departments from the tenacious grasp of Lavrenti Beria, and created an organization whose very name was intended to paralyze the enemy's will and instill trepidation in his own troops. Stalin personally crossed out the originally proposed abbreviation SMERSH, death to German spies, with a pencil, dryly remarking that agents of not only Germany but also other intelligence services were operating on Soviet soil, and therefore any spy should be punished regardless of nationality. Thus, SMERSH was born. In its 37 months of official existence, this agency became so enshrouded in a multitude of contradictory myths that even professional researchers still struggle to see through them. For some, SMERSH remains the greatest counterintelligence service of the 20th century, which outplayed the vaunted Abwehr of Admiral Canaris and saved the front from sabotage. For others, it was a merciless secret police that cut down combat officers based on absurd denunciations and turned the army into a space of total suspicion. To understand what this monster of the Soviet military machine truly was, we will have to cast aside ideological blinders, descend into the damp basements of frontline detention centers, unseal the secret directives of the Stavka, and look directly into the eyes of those who administered justice in the name of revolutionary expediency. Let us immediately clarify the key intrigue that Soviet textbooks preferred to ignore for decades. SMERSH was never a single organization. 3 independent agencies with this name were created simultaneously, but the main, defining, and terrifying one was the main Directorate of Counterintelligence of the People's Commissariat of Defense of the USSR. Its chief, 35-year-old Lieutenant General Viktor Abakumov, answered to only one man on the planet, the People's Commissar of Defense, that is, Stalin himself. Neither the General Staff nor the Marshals of Victory like Georgy Zhukov or Konstantin Rokossovsky, nor even the front commanders, had any formal authority over the army Chekists. On the contrary, in the headquarters of every army, every corps and division, there was a man with inconspicuous collar tabs or shoulder straps of the quartermaster or administrative service, who at any moment could open an operational investigative case against any general. This was the perfect embodiment of Stalin's system of checks and balances. The army was victorious, the generals were accruing glory, authority, and a dangerous independence for the tyrant, which meant that an invisible overseer with a drawn blade had to stand behind their backs. All activities of the Army counterintelligence unfolded in the conditions of a total war, the scale of which humanity has never known, before or since. By the spring of 1943, the German command had fully realized that the concept of blitzkrieg was buried at Stalingrad and shifted colossal resources to the secret war in the Soviet rear. The Abwehr, the 6th Directorate of the RSHA under Walter Schellenberg, and the network of intelligence organs, Vali, had established dozens of special schools in the occupied territories, in Borisov, Warsaw, Katowice, Smolensk, Poltava. Thousands of recruited prisoners of war, white émigrés, and anti-Soviet citizens underwent accelerated training in parachuting, sabotage, and topography, and were sent to the Soviet rear. German intelligence was infiltrating people by the hundreds, in entire groups, assigning tasks to blow up bridges on the Trans-Siberian Railway, destroy trainloads of tanks heading to the Kursk salient, and carry out terrorist acts against the High Command. And here, SMERSH demonstrated the filigree, almost mathematical cruelty of its protective function. The operational work of counterintelligence agents was built on creating a layered defensive zone. The entire frontline area, hundreds of kilometers deep, was transformed into a giant filtration net. Any person in military uniform, from a private to a colonel, who had fallen behind their unit, lost their documents, or was traveling without clear orders, was subjected to intense interrogation. And here, details came into play that today seem like cinematic classics, but back then cost human lives. Famous Soviet passports and Red Army service books were bound with simple metal staples, which, in the damp pocket of a tunic, would start to rust within a week, leaving characteristic brown stains on the paper. Meanwhile, German forgery masters in Berlin used first-class stainless steel. The document looked impeccably clean, and it was this German pedantry that became a direct ticket to the firing squad for an enemy agent. Counterintelligence agents knew, down to the smallest nuances, the structure of Soviet military units, the names of rear supply officers, the shape of seals, and the specific fonts of frontline printing houses. Slipping through this barrier was almost impossible. But the true triumph of the SMERSH professional counterintelligence was the radio games. Clandestine operations on a state scale, conducted by the Chekists under the guise of captured German radio operators. Let's contemplate the scale. During the war years, Soviet counterintelligence conducted up to 180 radio games simultaneously. A classic example, which has entered all the world's textbooks on intelligence services, is Operation Berezina, launched in August 1944. SMERSH, with the participation of famous masters of covert operations, Pavel Sudoplatov and Naum Eitingen, created a fictitious German military unit in the Belarusian forests. The so-called assault group of Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich Scherhorn, allegedly consisting of 2,000 encircled soldiers supposedly ready to fight their way back to their own lines. The German command, including Otto Skorzeny personally, and intelligence chief Schellenberg, believed this legend unconditionally. For many months, the Germans airdropped the latest weapons, radio stations, fake and genuine Soviet rubles, medicines, and their best sabotage instructors to Scherhorn's group across the front line. All the dropped supplies immediately went to the Red Army's warehouses, and the arriving German liaison officers and intelligence agents were handcuffed by SMERSH operatives right at the airplane steps. The German General Staff awarded Scherhorn the Knight's Cross. Hitler expressed his gratitude to him, and German transport squadrons burned precious aviation fuel, which was catastrophically scarce at the front, supplying a non-existent phantom army created in Abakumov's offices. It was a brilliant, virtuoso operational combination that demonstrated the absolute intellectual superiority of Soviet counterintelligence over the German war machine. However, this gleaming medal had a monstrous blood and tear-soaked reverse side, which historians fiercely debate today. SMERSH was not merely a special service protecting the army from external spies. It was flesh of Stalin's punitive system, where the main criterion for the success of any agency was measured solely by the number of enemies identified and neutralized. There was a rigid, cynical reporting system, and a SMERSH operational officer in a battalion or regiment could not report upwards that everything in his unit was clean and there were no traitors. If you had exposed no one during the reporting period, it meant you had lost your vigilance, were asleep at your post, or, even worse, were covering up anti-Soviet elements yourself. The system relentlessly demanded blood, demanded constant confirmation of its own necessity and indispensability. And it was here that Army counterintelligence came down upon its own with full force. Let us turn to the dry language of the criminal code of that era. The basis for the work of the SMERSH agents against the soldiers and commanders of the Red Army was the infamous Article 58 of the Criminal Code of the RSFSR, primarily its 10th point, anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda, and point 1b, treason against the motherland, committed by a military serviceman. What could be classified as anti-Soviet agitation in the trenches of 1943 or 1944? Any careless word uttered in the heat of the moment. A soldier, exhausted to the point of death, said that German machine guns were better than Soviet ones. This was praise of enemy technology and defeatism. An officer doubted the advisability of a frontal assault on an unnamed hill where his entire company had perished. This was discrediting the command and undermining military discipline. A lieutenant in a dugout read lines from a found German leaflet to his comrades. This was the distribution of enemy materials. The archives contain thousands of interrogation protocols where the tragedies of human lives are recorded with bureaucratic impassivity. The SMERSH informant network, the so-called sexots, secret collaborators, and little eyes, glazki, recruited from among soldiers, sergeants, rear echelon personnel, and staff officers, ensnared every combat unit. Recruitment was often carried out through blackmail, threats of being sent to the front lines, or reminders of a relative's dubious social origin. Just 2 corroborating reports from informants were enough to open a case file on a frontline soldier who had survived the hell of Stalingrad or Rzhev. A person would be arrested, typically suddenly, right at the command post or on the march. Their insignia would be torn off. They would be disarmed and sent to the Counterintelligence department. The investigative methods of the SMERSH investigative units differed little from the infamous practices of the NKVD of 1937. Sleepless nighttime interrogations, where the suspect was deprived of sleep for days, beatings, psychological pressure, threats of reprisals against families in the rear. The investigator's goal was not to establish the objective truth, but to obtain a personal confession of guilt. A confession is the queen of evidence. Prosecutor Vyshinsky's formula worked unfailingly. Military tribunals, working in tandem with counterintelligence, processed such cases on a conveyor belt. A session took from 10 to 20 minutes, without the participation of lawyers or witnesses. The sentence followed immediately, either execution before the formation or dispatch to a penal battalion to atone for guilt with blood, or 10 years in a strict regime camp with loss of rights. The story of the future Nobel laureate Alexander Solzhenitsyn is both indicative and tragic. Then a combat artillery captain, decorated with the Order of the Patriotic War and the Red Star, who had endured an extremely difficult combat path. He was arrested by SMERSH operatives right on the front line in East Prussia in February 1945. The reason? In personal correspondence with his school friend Nikolai Vitkevich, the captain had allowed himself critical remarks about the boss, Pakan, and had doubted the infallibility of the country's supreme leadership. The SMERSH military censorship, which opened millions of frontline letters, instantly caught the sedition. The captain was stripped of his rank and awards and received 8 years in the camps. And Solzhenitsyn was far from the only one. Hundreds of educated thinking officers whose only guilt was an unwillingness to blindly repeat the clichés of the political officers fell under the steamroller of censorship and accusations of terrorist intentions. A special chapter in the annals of SMERSH's activities, one that still sparks fierce debate among researchers, is its leadership and participation in the work of Army barrier troops and the vetting of Soviet servicemen who had escaped encirclement or been liberated from German captivity. Here, the myths of 90s and 2000s cinema paint a monstrous picture, as if behind every advancing regiment stood SMERSH machine gunners, ruthlessly mowing down retreating Red Army soldiers in the back. Let us examine this issue based on real operational documents, orders, and statistics from the main Directorate of Logistics and Counterintelligence. The famous Order Number 227 from the People's Commissar of Defense on July 28, 1942, popularly known as "Not a Step Back," did indeed mandate the formation within each army of barrier troops, 200 strong and armed with machine guns, to prevent the panicked flight of units. However, the direct function of the SMERSH barrier troops was not the total execution of panicking masses, but rather the establishment of dense screens on roads and river crossings to filter those retreating. The counterintelligence officers would identify within this mass outright deserters, malingerers, those who had self-inflicted wounds, commanders who had abandoned their weapons, and enemy agents attempting to infiltrate the Soviet rear under the guise of escaped, encircled soldiers. If we turn to the genuine reports on the activities of the barrier troops, we see a striking picture that shatters both the sugar-coated Soviet legends and the slanderous anti-Soviet myths. The overwhelming majority of detained soldiers and officers were not executed on the spot after an operational check and identification. They were formed into temporary battalions, rearmed, and sent back to the front lines, or directed to replenish reserve regiments. Only a few were subject to execution: outright instigators of panic, seasoned deserters, those with self-inflicted wounds who had deliberately shot themselves in the left hand through a loaf of bread or a wet rag to hide the powder burns. But the very procedure of this sorting of people, humiliating and permeated with the state's icy distrust of its own soldier, left an indelible psychological scar on the souls of the frontline soldiers. A much larger and more humanly tragic operation of SMERSH was the vetting of millions of Soviet citizens who had gone through the hell of German captivity, prisoners of war and so-called Ostarbeiter, those forcibly taken to the Third Reich for labor. By the beginning of 1945, when Soviet armies burst into Poland, Hungary, and Germany itself, counterintelligence faced a gigantic task: to vet and filter over 5 million people. A network of army and front-level verification and filtration camps and points was deployed. The logic of the Soviet leadership was merciless. The very fact of capture was considered treason against the motherland under Stalin's Order Number 270. "We have no prisoners of war, we have traitors." This cruel maxim defined the general atmosphere of the screenings. Every liberated soldier, emaciated by years of hunger, torture, and slave labor in Nazi concentration camps like Auschwitz, Majdanek, or Buchenwald, instead of the long-awaited embrace of the motherland and a return home, found himself behind the barbed wire of a Soviet verification and filtration point. There he faced endless interrogations by SMERSH investigators. Under what circumstances were you captured? Why didn't you use your last bullet on yourself? Who can confirm your behavior in the camp? Were you recruited by the camp administration or German intelligence services? Let's look at the archival data declassified by historians in recent decades, particularly the fundamental research of Viktor Zemskov and documents from the State Archive of the Russian Federation. The statistics shatter many stereotypes, but simultaneously reveal the scale of state suspicion. Out of more than 4 million screened Soviet prisoners of war and repatriated citizens, the absolute majority, over 75%, were found innocent after screening and either recalled to active military service or sent to restore the destroyed mines of Donbass, the factories of the Urals, and national economy construction projects. However, about 15 to 18% passed through the terrible millstones of repression. They were sentenced to long terms of imprisonment in the Gulag, sent to penal assault battalions, or to special settlements as persons who stained themselves by collaborating with the occupiers. But even for those who passed through the purgatory of the SMERSH screening and filtration camps without a criminal record, the stigma of having been in captivity or in occupied territory became a lifelong civic curse. In the famous Soviet questionnaire, an ominous column appeared, closing doors to higher education institutions, responsible jobs, and service in key branches of industry. SMERSH fulfilled the task of state security, weeding out among millions of prisoners the real traitors, punitive police collaborators, Vlasovites, and spies. But the price of this victory was paid for by the total humiliation and broken fates of hundreds of thousands of innocent people, whose only guilt was that in the chaos of 41 or 42, they were encircled due to the incompetence of the High Command. To obtain a complete three-dimensional historical picture, we must juxtapose three fundamentally different viewpoints, three irreconcilable perspectives on the SMERSH phenomenon: the official Soviet historiography, the testimonies and assessments of the German side, and the conclusions of modern independent researchers. The official Soviet concept, formed in the post-war decades and actively revived in modern patriotic circles, paints an image of an ideal shield and sword of the army. According to this version, SMERSH was the most effective counterintelligence service of World War II, unmatched in professionalism, courage, and devotion to the motherland. Soviet historians emphasized that during the war years, SMERSH operatives neutralized over 30,000 agents of German intelligence, prevented hundreds of major acts of sabotage in the rear of the active armies, captured and opened the secret archives of German special services in Vienna, Budapest, Königsberg, and Berlin, not allowing Nazi war criminals to escape retribution. Counterintelligence officers marched in the front ranks of assault groups, died in the trenches alongside the infantry, personally led the search for the secret bunkers of the Third Reich leadership, and they were the first to identify the remains of Hitler and Goebbels in the garden of the Reich Chancellery. Supporters of this viewpoint rightly point out that military counterintelligence suffered colossal combat losses. The average lifespan of a SMERSH operative at the front was only a few months. When a company or battalion commander was killed, it was often the counterintelligence officer who would rally the soldiers for an attack, restoring control of the battle by personal example. SMERSH is portrayed here as an organ of exceptional combat brotherhood and the highest Chekist skill, which cleansed the army of the filth of betrayal. And what does the defeated opponent say? If we open the memoirs and official documents of the leaders of German intelligence, the head of the Foreign Army's East Department, Reinhard Gehlen, the head of the 6th Directorate of the RSHA, Walter Schellenberg, officers of the Abwehr, we will see a mixture of professional horror and powerless acknowledgement of defeat. German analysts bitterly stated that by the end of 1943, the Soviet front and the near-front rear had become an absolute black hole for German agents. The effective operational lifespan of an agent dropped into the Soviet rear was reduced on average to 48 hours. They were either identified and arrested at the first document check, or they turned themselves in, understanding the inevitability of exposure. Gehlen, in his secret reports, admitted that the German High Command had practically gone blind on the Eastern Front, all attempts to uncover the strategic plans of the Soviet Stavka to determine the direction of the main attacks of the Soviet fronts before Operation Berezina or the Vistula-Oder offensive, failed spectacularly precisely because of the impenetrable counterintelligence cap created by SMERSH. However, German generals also noted something else. Soviet counterintelligence operated through methods of monstrous terror against its own population and soldiers, creating an atmosphere of universal fear where any mistake was punished by death. From the point of view of German strategists, the Soviet system won due to its willingness to pay the most extreme price in human lives. And finally, the third point of view, the conclusions of modern independent researchers relying on the bulk of declassified archival funds of the special departments, the main Directorate of Counterintelligence, the main Military Prosecutor's Office, and the investigative cases of repressed officers. Modern historians conclude that SMERSH was a complex, dualistic organism that simultaneously performed two mutually exclusive tasks in their ethical essence. On the one hand, it was a brilliant military institution solving the most complex tasks of classical counterintelligence, intercepting radio signals, agent penetration into the enemy's special services, disinformation of the enemy general staff, physical destruction of sabotage groups like the German Special Purpose Regiment Brandenburg 800. In this part of its work, SMERSH operated at the highest world level, demonstrating phenomenal operational flexibility and courage. On the other hand, SMERSH was a direct instrument of internal political control and preemptive state terror. The main internal goal of creating a structure directly subordinate to Stalin was to prevent the emergence of any sprouts of political free-thinking, conspiracies, or discontent with the highest party nomenclature within the army environment. The war awakened a colossal sense of self-worth in the Soviet people and the officer corps. The officers who liberated Europe saw with their own eyes the standard of living in Western countries, realized the monstrous price of the command's mistakes in '41, and began to ask uncomfortable questions. Why did the army suffer such catastrophic defeats? Why did the collective farm peasantry live in poverty? What would the USSR be like after victory? It was SMERSH that became the fire hydrant meant to douse these sentiments dangerous to the regime with icy water in their infancy. Counterintelligence conducted total surveillance of the high generals. Thick folders of operational development on front commanders, members of the military councils, and outstanding military commanders lay in Abakumov's safes. The famous post-war trophy affair and the crackdown on the Air Force generals, Air Marshal Novikov, People's Commissar of the aviation industry Shakurin, the arrests of Generals Gordov, Kulik, Ponedolin, all these blows were prepared in the silence of SMERSH offices by the very same investigators who caught German spies. The fate of SMERSH's own creator and permanent leader, Viktor Abakumov, represents a perfect, almost classical tragedy within a totalitarian system, vividly illustrating how this machine ultimately devours its own architects. In May 1946, when the war had been won and the army was transitioning to peacetime, Stalin liquidated SMERSH, dissolving its structures within the newly created Ministry of State Security, which Abakumov was appointed to lead. It seemed the general had reached the pinnacle of power. He held the party elite in fear, oversaw the investigation of the Leningrad affair, fabricated accusations against Beria's associates, and prepared for new, large-scale purges. But in July 1951, following a denunciation by his own subordinate, the head of the MGB's investigative department, Ryumin, who accused his boss of concealing a Jewish bourgeois nationalist conspiracy and sabotaging Stalin's directives, Abakumov was suddenly arrested on the direct order of the leader. The man before whose office door Soviet marshals trembled was thrown into Lefortovo prison. He was subjected to the very same sophisticated tortures he had sanctioned for years for others. He was kept in the cold, shackled in chains, deprived of sleep, and turned into a physical cripple. After Stalin's death and Beria's execution, the new masters of the Kremlin, led by Khrushchev, did not pardon the former head of SMERSH. In December 1954, Viktor Abakumov was sentenced by the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court to the ultimate punishment for falsifying criminal cases, treason, and terror, and was executed the same day. The system coldly disposed of its own executioner when he was no longer needed. And so now, as this grand, tragic, and bloody panorama is unfolded before us, from the secret radio games with the German General Staff to the nocturnal interrogations of combat captains in the damp basements of East Prussia, from the heroic deaths of operatives on nameless heights to the ruthless filtration of Soviet prisoners of war tormented by Nazism, we inevitably confront the main historical paradox of the era. Can these two facets of the military counterintelligence be separated? Could that great, effective service, which tightly sealed the Soviet front from the world's best intelligence, have existed without this monstrous system of internal suspicion, denunciation, and the most severe pressure on its own army? Or was the impeccable effectiveness of SMERSH on the external front a direct, inevitable consequence of that inhuman internal cruelty, where the price of an individual soldier's or officer's life equated to absolute zero in the face of the state machine? Let us ponder this question not as detached judges from a comfortable future, but with an understanding of the mortal combat in which the very fate of our people's physical existence was being decided. Weigh all the facts, documents, figures, and eyewitness accounts we have discussed today. Who has SMERSH remained for you in the mirror of history, the savior of the active army, without whom victory at the front would have been impossible, or a merciless, repressive hammer that inflicted deep wounds upon its own people in the name of preserving the absolute power of one man? I leave the choice of the final answer and historical justice exclusively to you.